I'm going to start with a question. And I'm going to bet that everyone in this room is going to answer yes to this question. Raise your hand if you've ever learned a second or additional language. Recently or long ago when you were much younger? It could have been because you didn't really have a choice. It could have been because you wanted to and you chose to. It could have been in a formal education setting or on your own, informally, online, or with a group of people. The circumstances don't matter, right? You just raise your hand if you've learned a second or additional language. Now, the next question I'm going to ask, you can answer in your head because it can get kind of personal. When you were in the process of learning that second or additional language, did you ever think, feel, or perceive that your language production wasn't quite measuring up to the standard of a native speaker? Now, probably in your head, the answer is also yes. If you learned an additional language in a classroom setting, the native speaker standard would have been there in the models, the materials, the textbook, the multimedia you were exposed to, the grammar that was tested, the pronunciation that was taught, and maybe even the teacher was selected to be a native speaker. And if you learned another language in an informal setting, online, on your own, or with a group of people, you still probably wouldn't have been free of the native speaker standard. You probably found yourself applying this standard when it came to looking for conversation partners or learning materials, and you probably found yourself comparing your language production to that of native speakers. So, the native speaker standard is a widely accepted societal norm. In some ways, it is logical, and in some ways, it actually reflects good approaches to additional language learning. For example, it could mean that we have high expectations for our language learning outcomes, or that we respect the target language and its speakers, and we want to get the language right. My purpose today is not to dismiss these ways of thinking, because I do think they're valid. But I also want to point out why having a native speaker standard can have a negative impact on society, and why, from an applied linguist point of view, why the native speaker standard may be scientifically impossible to begin with. Okay, so let's start with a target. I want you to think of someone you know, could be a friend, an acquaintance, maybe even your significant other, who is academically and professionally fluent in a second or additional language. I'll give you 10, 20 seconds. Or, I probably don't need to give you that much time because there are probably many people in your life who fit this description. And I want you to take one of those people and keep them in your mind and ask yourself, are they native-like? And the answer is probably no. Despite being a fully fluent bilingual, this person is not like two monolingual people in one body. They cannot speak language A, like a person who only knows language A, and then speak language B, like a person who only knows language B. Based on their ways of speaking, you can tell that one of the languages is their first or native language, and the other language is a second or additional language, and they speak a different language as their first language. So the fully fluent bilingual is not like two monolingual people in one body. Now, what about the person who grew up with two languages from birth? Could they fit the description of two monolingual people in one body? Well, let me use myself as an example. I have been talking to you for about 5 minutes in English, and you can probably tell that my English is tinged with a Filipino accent, just as my Filipino is tinged with an English accent. I grew up with two languages from birth, and I speak both of them with an in-between accent. That's a mix of both languages. It comes out stronger when I'm talking to my parents. And so the cost of any form of bi- or multilingualism is that the languages influence one another. Also, people like me who grew up with two languages, even though we have a strong grammar intuition in both our languages, we don't tend to develop them to the same degrees because one's the dominant language in society and we're schooled in it, so we can read and write better in it. We have a wider range of vocabulary in it, and we use it for a wider range of social occasions. So, just like the other type of bilingual who learned another language later in life, we are not like two monolinguals in one person. We cannot speak language A with no influence from language B, or language B with no influence from language A. Whether someone grew up with two languages or learned another language to full fluency later in life, they aren't like two monolinguals in one. And so the standard of two monolinguals in one, aka the native speaker standard, is questionable when applied to any form of bi or multilingualism in terms of who can actually attain it, even if it's a widely accepted societal norm. In other words, it's impossible. And yet, we continue to think of native speakers as the standard, especially native speakers who don't speak any other language, because when they speak their language production is, quote, pure and perfect. But in fact, no one's language production is pure and perfect, not even in their first language, and not even if they don't speak any other language. We can take the goddess Venus as an example. We may think of her as the embodiment of femininity, but in fact, there's no person on earth who could embody what's shown in these works of art. So it's the same with a native speaker standard. It's an ideal, not a real person. Now, let's talk about the science behind why no one is pure, not even in their native language. We're all born with a mental structure that allows us to process language, and the person credited with discovering this is the applied linguist Noam Chomsky. That mental structure that we're all born with is called universal grammar, and it looks the same for everybody at birth. Picture universal grammar like a net. In the early years of life, when we're immersed in one or two languages, that net gets shaped a certain way and then becomes stiffer, less flexible, leading to our accent, our intuitive grammar knowledge, our preferred ways of saying things, and so on. You'll have the same tendencies as other people who grew up with the same one or two languages, but there's more to the story. Your language use is more, way more, than just your first language. Here's why. Let's take the case of two siblings. We can even make them identical twins here in Hong Kong. So, same genes, same family and community, same first languages, Chinese and English. Each twin experiences a unique set of life events. One of them forms an international peer group in university with Malaysian, British, German, and Chinese friends, and the other studies abroad in North Carolina and makes friends from across the United States. Later on, they both enter different workplaces with different languages and patterns of language use. One of them marries a person from mainland China who's trilingual, and the other marries a trilingual person from India. All these life experiences shape their individual language nets in individually unique ways. For example, Matt at the University of Hong Kong might call it the lift, but switch to calling rain lok soi, because that's what his Malaysian friends call rain in Cantonese. In contrast, Pat might switch to saying elevator after a year in the United States, but continue saying lok yu for rain, like he and his brother did growing up. Later on, they'll each learn new swear words in one of their first languages. And then, years down the line, when Matt puts his kids to sleep, he'll say shui instead of fan, like his parents did when he was growing up. And when Pat makes his kids lunch, he'll say tiffin instead of bento, and then he'll forget that Matt doesn't know this word and use it with Matt when Matt comes to visit. And given that their language nets are always changing in these different ways over their lives, it's hard to tell which of them is the pure and perfect native speaker. of either of their languages. We can also try an interesting experiment with the brothers. If we present them with two nearly identical sentences in one of their first languages, English, and ask them which sentence is more like what native English speakers would say, and we ask them separately, so they each have to give their own answer. We might find that Matt thinks the first sentence is more native-like, while Pat guesses the second sentence is more like what native English speakers would say. And interestingly, their answers will not just be based on what they've heard native English speakers say more or less, but on the grammar structures and patterns they're more used to or less used to hearing across all their languages. 5 years later, they may not give the same answers because in 5 years, they could have moved cities, entered new social networks, gotten more or less used to different ways of saying things. This is what we applied linguists are interested in studying today. Not just how first language influences second language learning, but how the individual language net is shaped over the course of life as a unique work of art in its own right, always evolving from the previous shape it had due to the many linguistic influences that have accumulated over life. And yet, you may know somebody, and it might be the person you thought about earlier, who goes around saying, well, someone tells me I sound like a native speaker in my second language. This actually speaks less to the person's language production and more to the selectivity of others' judgment. When we assume someone's going to be native-like or non-native-like in a language based on their racial appearance or what they've told us about their education, we tend to focus on those aspects of their language production that confirm what we already believe and ignore other aspects of their grammar or pronunciation that go against our preconceptions. But at the end of the day, does it really matter? Even if someone's language production is clearly not native-like or even fluent, what does that mean for their ability to communicate in another language? If someone talks to you in your native language, think how long it took them to learn your language to enable you to have that conversation, especially if you haven't needed to learn their language. In my case, as a foreigner here in Hong Kong, I try to compensate for my lack of Chinese knowledge by using negotiation for meaning strategies in English. An applied linguist named Mike Long documented many of these strategies, like slowing down your speech, pausing before key words, repeating what you say in various ways, or repeating what others say to check you understood them correctly. Researchers who study English communication between non-native speakers with different first languages have found that they're very collaborative in this regard. Maybe they should be the models for effective English communication. They're constantly on the lookout for what others are saying, taking it up not because it's native-like, but because it's working in that conversation to convey meaning. And so they end up coining interesting terms like for sardines, they'll say pickle of fish, or for sauerkraut, they'll say pickle of cabbage. What I'm trying to get at with these examples is that if you want to learn what native speakers say, go ahead. But that's different from applying a native speaker standard to social relations, which should be equal. We know that in many aspects of life, people are discriminated against, not because they can't communicate in a language, but because they fail to communicate in the same way as native speakers who speak no other language. And for this trivial reason, they're discriminated against in education, in employment, and in housing. And we also know in my profession that international scholars have a hard time publishing their work in English, not because they can't write in English, but because they have to write in native-like English. It takes them longer, if they succeed at all, to publish work in English and share this knowledge with the world. And so when it comes to applying the native speaker standard in social relations, I think it's important to think how we can shape these in more equitable ways. So how do we do this? To go with the theme of this conference, I'd like you to think of the individual mind like a kaleidoscope. A kaleidoscope filled with the individual's bits of language knowledge in Cantonese, English, Putonghua, Urdu, and imagine life events twisting that kaleidoscope in different ways. We constantly forget language knowledge. We constantly pick up new language knowledge, not only in additional languages, but our native language. As the applied linguist Jan Blommaert pointed out, the patterns change throughout life, But at no point is the pattern of your language knowledge incomplete or inferior to any other pattern. It's simply what you need to have based on who you are, where you are, and what you're trying to accomplish. And so if you go back to that time in the past when you had to learn a second or additional language, raise your hand if you've ever managed to order food or drink in the language. Raise your hand if you've had a meaningful conversation in the language. And raise your hand if you've passed an especially difficult exam in the language. All these are genuine accomplishments in the language. And even if the patterns have changed since then, and you've forgotten certain things and learned other things based on what's happened in your life, you can still communicate effectively across language differences. The key to this is not the native speaker standard or any other form of proficiency, but the willingness to meet one another as equal partners in meaning making. Thank you.